I just think a lot of people would know this wonderful, wonderful location. There's Casey doing some intern work with the guide. But yeah, beautiful location. But not a beautiful story. This is quite shocking, really. We're talking the 1st of October, 1798.
1798, so just about 4 months after the height of the rebellion, but it's still going on.
Right.
Because there's still sort of guerrilla operations in Wicklow. Michael Dwyer, of course, up in the hills would have been the most famous. But there are rebel activities, and there are also yeoman activities. The yeomen were sort of the FCA of the time, the citizen militia, and they were pretty ill-disciplined, and of course a lot of them had grudges as well because they'd suffered during the rebellion themselves. So they weren't under proper control, and they were going around the place as well. There are stories, there's allegations in this particular case that they actually had a shoot to kill policy. If they came across a rebel, they were entitled to shoot them.
Which is kind of what happened here. We're talking about a man who had, luckily for him, been pardoned, saved from the death penalty by Elizabeth Latouche, sort of stepped forward and saved Thomas Dogherty. He was now living with his mother in a cabin here in Delgany. On this fateful day, a man from a different political point of view stepped through the door with a gun.
Yeah. Now we can actually focus it down to the day and the hour. It was a Monday. It was the 1st of October, and it was between 9 and 10 o'clock in the morning. And they call him a boy. They don't give his age, but they call him a boy. And he obviously he thought at this stage he thought his worst days were over. He had been arrested. He'd been sentenced to death. Elizabeth Latouche had intervened for him, and he was now at home with his mother. And there he was in the cabin with the mother, with a couple of sisters and some other children. And a man called Hugh Woolaghan, who was part of the Newtown Mankeldy militia, burst through the door. Now he had 2 companions with him, but they didn't apparently take any part in what happened afterwards. 2 men from the Fox family.
Okay.
And he said, "Are you Doherty's eldest son?" And the boy said yes, and he said, "Then you're going to die." And the boy said, no, I haven't done anything. And he said, "If you want to," he said, "we'll go up before Mr. Latouche, who I presume was a magistrate, and let him decide." And Woolaghan said, "I don't give a damn for Latouche any more than I do for you, and I'm going to your day has come," sort of thing.
Yeah.
So the mother, God love her, intervened, and as transpired later, she'd had an awful time anyway. But she intervened, and there was a struggle, and the boy was shot, but not fatally, in the arm, I think. And Woolaghan then left the house and came back in a few minutes later. And it sounds as if he said, "Is he dead?" And she said, "Oh yeah, he is," obviously hoping that it would all blow over. And he said, "Well, just to make sure," and he shot him, and that killed him.
That idea that in history there's always been divisions in many countries and many towns. Would there have been, do you think, equal kind of support for these 2 men, or was one clearly the baddie here and one was, because your political leanings will say, well, you might not want someone like Doherty around because he believes in one political set of ideas, and I don't know whether that you would have thought.
Well, I think Doherty, the rebellion had been essentially defeated.
Right.
Doherty was at home and was probably living a peaceful life at that stage. Now there were attempts later on, and we'll talk about that in a minute, to show that they were still involved in some kind of treason, but it doesn't really ring true. So no, he was shooting an unarmed man.
Right.
There was
absolutely no question. It was an ugly.
Oh,
scenario.
Absolutely, yeah.
But the idea about in the streets, there would have been, some who supported, one particular idea, and others who felt the other way, and whether this guy just thought he was basically doing God's work.
Well, he does. No, I don't know that God came into it, but he does say at his trial later on, because it did come to trial. He does say at his trial that there was because of the atrocities and so on which had occurred during the rebellion, that there was a degree of animosity that there wouldn't otherwise have been. So there was obviously stuff going on. Now, I did wonder if there was any kind of a personal quarrel between them, and that is raised on a couple of occasions, but both his mother and other people actually denied it. Okay. So it seems to be that he somehow had his eye on him. Yeah.
Now, we should say that the court martial happened on the 13th of October.
So not that long afterwards. Yeah.
Now people who don't know the result look away now, but he was acquitted, and that in its way actually had more repercussions than anyone probably would have thought.
Well,
at the
yeah,
time.
but the trial was printed afterwards, so we can read it now. And the principal prosecution witness was the mother, who actually described exactly what had happened. And that's how we know the story. And she told the story that I've just said about him coming in and so on. And then there were a stream of witnesses who were mainly produced to prove that Woolaghan was a good type and that Dogherty was involved in treason. And there was a very interesting little sort of sidelight, because a man called, I think it was Richard Byrne, alleged that at the inquest into Thomas Dogherty, a couple of days after his death, that a paper had dropped out of the mother's pocket. And he had picked it up, and he had thought, because he was illiterate, he thought that it might be a banknote, but when he looked at it he thought no. So he showed it to somebody else, and they said, oh, it's a good thing, show it to to some of Woolaghan's comrades, which he did, and it turned out to be a song, a rebel song calling on the French for help. So this was produced to show, supposedly, that they were still actively involved. Now, it sounds far too convenient. What's she doing with a rebel song shoved in her pocket on the day of her son's inquest? Yeah. But they produced this, and they also produced some of his comrades who said that he was a good comrade, and that he was never known to break rules and so on. They also talked about this policy of shoot to kill, that this was accepted. So, of course, that was regarded as some sort of justification. But there were a couple of interesting little things about the way the neighbourhood worked. For instance, one neighbour came forward to say that Mrs. Dogherty had come to him, I should have said her cabin was burned during the course of the rebellion by the Crown forces. And the day afterwards, she turned up at this neighbour's house, who was obviously a loyalist, and asked him to keep some stuff for her during the course while things were unsettled. And I thought that was interesting, because that shows that you've got some sort of neighbourly feeling going on, even at the height of this awful rebellion. And then this Richard Byrne, the man who Maria picked up the paper, he said that a few months before the rebellion broke out, that he had seen the Doghertys, the father and another brother and the dead boy, drilling in a field belonging to Mr. Johnson at Killincarrick, who must have been a sympathiser as well, and that they were United Irish volunteers who were actually drilling. So it's those sort of little insights as well that are interesting.
Well, we'll link. I know you did a wonderful article on the Heritage site, and we'll link to the transcript as well of the actual court case. I'm just trying to think whether at that time this was a shock, or whether there was always potential for killing in the air at that time in Ireland, that like something like this would have been in national news, or was it just that it was a local?
It was national news. I mean, there are accounts in English papers, for instance. It did cause a sensation. I mean, there must have been a lot of violence going on, and if this policy of shoot to kill was active around the place, then there must have been quite a number of these cases. But this hit the headlines. I think it was probably just so brutal. The boy was young, he was unarmed, his mother was there. It was just too bad to ignore. So 2 weeks later, Woolaghan is up in front of a court-martial, and they heard all this evidence. They let him off in the end. They found that he had killed Thomas Dogherty. Well, there was no denying it, but that he wasn't guilty of murder. But the Lord Lieutenant then, the man to whom Elizabeth Latouche had talked initially, and I wonder if she had a part to play in this as well, he actually intervened. He said that it had been a cruel and barbarous murder, and he barred Wilmington from ever wearing the King's uniform again, either in the militia or in the army. And he also dissolved the court-martial.
And would you say there was beyond repercussions for him? I don't know whether there was a domino effect with this court case generally. I don't know whether it would have been ultimately in PR wars. This was probably better for Doherty's side than because it would have been. I'm guessing there would have been a question mark over this kind of acquittal, that this really was a clear-cut case of somebody walking into a man's house and killing him.
Yeah, and I think also the Lord Lieutenant was trying to implement a new policy, a policy of conciliation to bring an end to the violence and the enmity. So this obviously ran counter to that. So that's why he intervenes. So yeah, it is part of sort of a wider political picture.
Now you'd be far more familiar with the history around here than I would, and that kind of element of love hate the early years, the idea that there were killings, there were
and Wicklow actually was very much the centre of that kind of thing as well, wasn't it? I mean, Wicklow and Wexford, this area apart from the north were really the most active areas in 1798.
Was that just a random factor, or do you think there was influences? Was it the nearness to Dublin? Was there a sense of being near the centre of the country in a way if you're near Dublin? I don't know if there's factors that would come into that, whether we were just because you think about political activism deeper down in the country, and that there's a sort of a hiding in the bushes almost, whereas Wicklow would seem to be close to the fire, a little bit sort of I don't know if there was.
Yeah, I mean Wexford gets a lot. I'm not an expert now on this particular area, and a lot has been written about it. Wexford, of course, was a particular area, and you do have sort of a middle class leadership, even a gentry leadership down there, and then the sort of the peasants joining in as well. And the whole idea of coming from France, the ideas of liberty, equality and fraternity, and then that gets mixed up and perverted really by sectarianism in Ireland as well.
Right. And I'm thinking our geography, I mean, you think of the Kilcool gun running and all that, we seem, I suppose we have sort of like we're in a good location, so to speak, for activity of sorts. And
well, there's 100 years between them.
True, but I'm just thinking later on that our geography kind of plays a part maybe in some of the... but maybe
I think one of the interesting things too is the Latouches' attitude. I mean, clearly they would have been loyalists, but they obviously also had some sort of loyalty and humanitarian feeling towards their own tenants, because I think Doherty's must have been their tenants, because they would have been on the land, and they obviously kind of regarded them as being their protectors in a way.
Well, they do seem like an incredible family, that they well above and beyond any kind of real call of duty when it came to the people in their care, we'll say, and people that lived and worked around them, that they were... Yeah,
they certainly regarded themselves, I think, as having a responsibility to their tenants and to the people, their dependents, I suppose, in the area.
In conclusion, we are a bloodthirsty killing lot around here. That's mainly what you're telling us. Right?
Not this morning.